"Officer, before you make this mistake permanent, you should answer your phone." Marcus Reed's voice was calm, almost unnervingly calm, as red and blue lights washed across the side of his black SUV and painted the empty roadside in restless color. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood a few feet away, one hand resting near his radio, the other holding Marcus's driver's license as though it were evidence of something far more serious than a late-night traffic stop. The road stretched dark in both directions, bordered by shuttered storefronts and a gas station glowing under harsh white lights nearly half a mile away. Marcus stood beside his vehicle with his hands secured behind him, his suit jacket slightly wrinkled from the encounter, his expression controlled. Whitmore looked at him and smirked. "Everybody's got something to say once the cuffs go on," he said. Marcus did not answer. He simply looked toward the phone resting on the hood of the patrol car. It had buzzed twice already. Whitmore ignored it both times. That was 18 minutes after Marcus had left a federal building downtown carrying a sealed leather folder, answered one final work call, and started the drive home. It should have been uneventful. He had driven less than 6 miles when the patrol lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He pulled over immediately, lowered his window, placed both hands where they could be seen, and waited. Whitmore approached slowly, flashlight sweeping across the dashboard, the passenger seat, then Marcus's face. License and registration. Marcus handed them over without argument. The documents were current. The vehicle was registered in his name. No warrants. No alerts. Nothing unusual. Yet Whitmore remained beside the window. "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work?" Marcus studied him for half a second. "Legal." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "That's pretty vague." Marcus glanced at the patrol car behind him, then back at the officer. "Is there a reason I was stopped?" The question was polite. That seemed to make it worse. Whitmore told him he had changed lanes improperly. Marcus knew he had signaled. He remembered the click of the turn indicator because he had been listening to it while thinking about the briefing scheduled for the next morning. Still, he did not argue. He asked if there was anything else. Whitmore stared into the vehicle again. His flashlight stopped briefly on the leather folder in the back seat. A corner of a government envelope was visible beside it, marked with the seal of the Department of Justice. Whitmore barely looked at it. "Step out of the car." Marcus's expression changed, not with fear, but recognition. He had spent years listening to people describe moments like this, moments when a routine question became something else. He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the pavement. "Am I being detained?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You ask a lot of questions. It's important to understand what's happening." That was when Whitmore decided calm sounded like defiance. Within minutes, Marcus was standing beside the SUV, restrained, while the body camera on Whitmore's chest recorded every word. Marcus looked at the blinking red light, then at Whitmore. "You may want to call your supervisor." Whitmore gave a short laugh. "I don't need permission to do my job." Marcus looked once more toward the phone on the hood. This time, it began to ring. The screen lit up in the darkness. "Captain Hayes." Whitmore glanced at the name, then at Marcus, whose expression had not changed. "You should take that," Marcus said quietly. Whitmore stared at the glowing screen for a second too long, as though ignoring the call might somehow make it disappear, but the name remained there, bright against the dark hood of the patrol car. "Captain Hayes." Marcus stood quietly beside his vehicle, the red and blue lights moving across his face in slow waves, his expression unreadable. Whitmore finally picked up the phone. "Officer Whitmore." His voice was steady at first. Then he listened. Marcus could not hear every word, but he did not need to. He watched Whitmore's posture change. The shoulders that had been squared with certainty began to tighten. The confident look faded. "Yes, sir," Whitmore said. A pause. "Traffic stop. Black male, early 40s, black sport utility vehicle." Another pause. Whitmore glanced at Marcus. "Marcus Reed." Silence followed, longer this time. The highway seemed strangely quiet, with only the soft hiss of tires from a distant car and the low hum of the gas station lights down the road. Then Whitmore's eyes shifted back to Marcus, not with suspicion now, but confusion. "Yes, sir, he is standing right here." Marcus lowered his gaze for a moment, watching the light from the patrol car pulse across the pavement. He had heard this tone before, not from Whitmore specifically, but from people who suddenly realized that the situation they thought they controlled had changed. Whitmore turned slightly away. "No, sir, I have not completed the report." Another pause. Yes, the body camera is active. That answer seemed to matter. Marcus looked toward the small red indicator on Whitmore's chest. It had been recording since the beginning. Every question, every assumption, every decision. Whitmore's voice dropped. Understood. He ended the call but did not move immediately. For the first time since the stop began, he looked uncertain about what came next. Marcus did not smile. He did not ask what the captain had said. He simply waited. Whitmore finally stepped closer and said, "I am going to remove the restraints." Marcus turned slightly to make it easier. The cuffs came off with a quiet metallic click, and Marcus slowly brought his hands forward, rubbing one wrist with the other. "Am I free to go?" he asked. Whitmore hesitated. "Captain Hayes wants you to remain here for a few minutes." Marcus raised his eyes. "For what reason?" Whitmore opened his mouth, then stopped. It was the first question Marcus had asked all night that the officer seemed afraid to answer. A second patrol vehicle appeared in the distance, its headlights approaching fast, but without emergency lights. Marcus watched it pull onto the shoulder behind Whitmore's cruiser. A tall man in uniform stepped out. Whitmore straightened immediately. Captain Robert Hayes walked toward them with the measured pace of someone trying to understand how a routine evening had become a problem before he had even arrived. His eyes went first to Marcus, then to Whitmore, then to the body camera. "Mr. Reed," Hayes said, his tone formal, "I apologize for the circumstances." Whitmore looked between them. The title caught his attention, but not enough to explain the urgency of the phone call. Marcus nodded once. "Captain," Hayes took a slow breath. "We need to speak privately." Marcus glanced toward Whitmore. "No. Whatever needs to be said can be said here." Hayes understood immediately. The camera was still recording. Whitmore was still listening. And the truth, whatever it was no longer going to be handled quietly. Captain Hayes held Marcus's gaze for a long moment before looking toward Whitmore. "Officer, explain the basis for the stop." The question was simple, but Whitmore answered as if every word now carried weight. "Improper lane change, sir." Hayes glanced toward Marcus's vehicle, then back at him. "And the detention?" Whitmore shifted his stance. "I believe there were inconsistencies." Marcus remained silent, letting the officer's own explanation fill the space between them. Hayes asked what those inconsistencies were. Whitmore mentioned Marcus's answers, the neighborhood, the late hour, and the fact that Marcus had been carrying government documents. Marcus finally spoke. "You mean the documents you saw after you decided I was suspicious?" Whitmore looked at him, but said nothing. Hayes's expression tightened. "Was his license valid?" "Yes, sir." "Registration?" "Valid." "Any warrants?" "No, sir." Hayes took a slow breath. "Any evidence of a crime?" Whitmore hesitated. That hesitation said more than an answer could have. Marcus looked beyond them toward the gas station, where a man near the pumps still held a phone in their direction. The night had changed completely. 18 minutes earlier, Marcus had been alone with an officer who believed his authority required no explanation. Now there was a witness, a supervisor, a body camera, and a record that could not simply be reduced to one man's version of events. Hayes lowered his voice. "Mr. Reed, I want to be clear. You are not under arrest." Marcus nodded. "Then I am free to leave." Hayes paused. "Yes." Marcus did not move. Instead, he walked to the open rear door of his vehicle and looked inside. Without touching anything, the leather folder remained where he had left it. Beside it sat the sealed Department of Justice envelope. Whitmore followed his eyes and finally seemed to understand that the papers were not random decorations in an expensive car. Marcus turned back. "Officer Whitmore asked what kind of legal work I do." Whitmore's face went still. Hayes closed his eyes briefly, as if hoping the next sentence would somehow be different from the one he already knew was coming. Marcus continued in the same measured tone. "My office represents the United States in federal matters for this district." Whitmore stared at him. Marcus did not emphasize the words. He did not need to. "You are," Whitmore started. Hayes finished for him. "The United States Attorney." The distant traffic seemed to fade. Whitmore looked at Marcus, then at the body camera on his own chest. The tiny red light continued blinking. Marcus noticed the exact moment the officer understood what that meant. But Marcus's expression did not change. "My title is not the important part," he said. "The important part is that you had all the information you needed before you knew my title." Hayes looked toward Whitmore, whose confidence had drained into silence. Marcus stepped closer to his vehicle, but still did not leave. There was something else he needed to know. Captain, how did you know my name before Officer Whitmore told you who I was? Hayes did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the patrol car, then down the dark road. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its official calm. Because your name came across my desk this morning. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Hayes continued. Along with a request from the Department of Justice concerning traffic stops in this precinct. Whitmore's face changed again. This time, it was not confusion. It was recognition. Whitmore said nothing, but Marcus saw the answer in his face before Captain Hayes explained it. The officer had heard about the review. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every name, but enough to know that the Department of Justice had started asking questions about traffic stops connected to this precinct. Hayes looked toward the blinking body camera and then back at Marcus. The request came through this morning. Records, stop data, complaints, body camera retention. Your office wanted everything preserved. Marcus nodded slowly. That is correct. Whitmore finally spoke. I did not know he was involved. Marcus turned toward him. That is exactly the problem. The words were quiet, but they landed with more force than anger could have. Whitmore's jaw tightened. I made a judgment call. Based on what? Marcus asked. Whitmore looked toward the road, as if an answer might be waiting in the darkness. The vehicle. The hour. The area. Marcus held his gaze. And me? Whitmore did not respond. Hayes stepped between the silence and the accusation before either could harden further. Officer, did dispatch provide any alert connected to this vehicle? No, sir. Any description connected to a reported crime? No, sir. Any reason to believe Mr. Reed was armed, wanted, or dangerous? Whitmore looked uncomfortable. No, sir. Marcus inhaled slowly and looked toward his sport utility vehicle. The sealed folder in the rear seat suddenly felt less like paperwork and more like a mirror. For weeks, his office had reviewed complaints written in careful language by people who said their ordinary drives had turned into prolonged questioning for reasons they could not understand. Some described being asked where they were going, who owned their cars, why they were in certain neighborhoods. Others said the official reason for the stop changed after the officer began asking questions. Every report had been reduced to timestamps, badge numbers, written statements, and video requests. On paper, patterns could seem distant. Standing under flashing patrol lights, Marcus no longer had that distance. How many stops have you made tonight? He asked. Whitmore frowned. What? How many traffic stops? I do not know. 5, maybe 6. How many involved drivers who were asked what they did for a living? Whitmore's face changed. Hayes looked at him sharply. Marcus continued. How many involved a valid license, valid registration, no warrant, and still ended with someone outside the vehicle? Whitmore shifted his weight. You are turning this into something it is not. Marcus looked at him for a long second. No, I am asking you to tell us what it is. The gas station witness remained in the distance, phone still raised. A car passed on the far side of the road, its headlights briefly washing over all 3 men before disappearing. Hayes reached toward his radio but stopped. Officer Whitmore, do not deactivate your camera. Whitmore stared at him. Sir, keep it running. The command was calm and unmistakable. Marcus looked at Hayes. And preserve the dash camera from the beginning of the stop. Hayes nodded. Agreed. Whitmore's confidence was now gone, replaced by the growing awareness that the encounter was no longer about whether Marcus would receive a warning or be allowed to drive away. The stop itself had become evidence. Marcus stepped closer, not threatening, not triumphant, simply certain. Officer Whitmore, earlier you told me you document criminals every night. Whitmore looked down. Marcus glanced at the red light on the body camera. Tonight, the camera documented a decision. The question now is whether that decision was an exception or part of a pattern. Hayes turned toward the patrol car. We are going back to the precinct. Whitmore looked up quickly. All of us. Hayes answered without hesitation. Especially you. Marcus watched the officer process the words, and for the first time that night, Whitmore was no longer the man asking the questions. The drive back to the precinct took less than 15 minutes, but the silence inside the convoy made it feel longer. Marcus followed in his own vehicle behind Captain Hayes, while Whitmore drove the patrol car ahead with the body camera still active and the dash camera recording every mile. The city had settled into its late-night rhythm, traffic thinning, storefronts dark, streetlights casting long amber reflections across the pavement. Marcus kept both hands on the wheel and replayed the stop in his mind, not because he doubted what had happened, but because details mattered. Exact words, exact timing, exact decisions. That was how truth survived when memory became inconvenient. At the precinct, Hayes led them through a side entrance and into a conference room away from the main desk. The room was plain, fluorescent lights overhead, a long table in the center, a wall clock ticking loudly enough to make the quiet uncomfortable. Whitmore took a seat near the end of the table. Marcus remained standing. Hayes placed a folder on the table and looked at Whitmore. Before anything else, I want your written account of the stop while it is fresh. Whitmore nodded, but his hand hesitated before reaching for the pen. Marcus noticed. People were often confident when speaking in the moment. Writing things down was different. Written words stayed. Hayes turned to Marcus. You can leave if you want. We will preserve everything. Marcus shook his head. I would rather stay until the footage is secured. Hayes did not argue. A technician arrived a few minutes later and confirmed that the body camera file had been uploaded automatically when Whitmore entered the building. The dash camera recording was transferred separately. Marcus watched the process without interfering. No speeches, no threats, just preservation. Whitmore looked increasingly uncomfortable as the technician read out timestamps. The stop had lasted 23 minutes. The license check had come back clean within the first 4. Registration was confirmed less than a minute later. After that, the timeline became harder for Whitmore to explain. Hayes pulled up the dispatch log. No reported vehicle match, he said. No outstanding alert. No request for backup based on threat. Whitmore looked down at the table. I thought his behavior was suspicious. Marcus finally sat across from him. Which behavior? Whitmore looked up. The questions. The way you challenged every instruction. Marcus nodded once. I asked why I was stopped. I asked whether I was being detained. I asked for the legal basis. Those are questions, not threats. Whitmore's expression tightened. You were not acting like a normal driver. The room became still. Hayes slowly turned his head toward him. Marcus did not react immediately. He let the sentence remain in the air. What does a normal driver look like? He asked. Whitmore realized the mistake before he answered. That is not what I meant. Then explain what you meant. Whitmore leaned back and looked toward Hayes, but the captain did not rescue him. Marcus watched him carefully. This was the moment the stop stopped being about one bad decision. Not because Marcus wanted it to be larger, but because Whitmore's own words kept opening doors. Hayes tapped the folder in front of him. There is something else you need to understand. Whitmore looked up. Hayes opened the file. Inside were summaries from previous complaints, dates, locations, and traffic stop reports collected over several months. The Department of Justice did not ask for these records because of one incident tonight. Whitmore stared at the pages. Marcus remained silent. Hayes continued. They asked because there is already a pattern under review. The fluorescent hum suddenly seemed louder. Whitmore looked from the folder to Marcus. Marcus finally spoke. That is why the footage matters. Not because of who I am. Because if tonight looks like other nights, then this is no longer one officer making one questionable call. Whitmore swallowed hard. So this was a setup? Marcus's expression hardened for the first time. No, I was driving home. He leaned forward slightly. And that may be the most important fact in this room. For several seconds, no one spoke. Whitmore looked at the complaint summaries spread across the table as if they belonged to someone else, someone whose choices could still be separated from his own. Marcus watched him carefully. He had seen that reaction before in depositions, in hearings, in conference rooms where people encountered the documented version of behavior they had always explained away in private. Whitmore finally leaned back. You are making this sound deliberate. Marcus answered without raising his voice. I am saying patterns matter. Hayes pulled one of the reports closer. 3 months ago, driver stopped after leaving a pharmacy. Valid license. Valid registration. No citation issued. Detained for 19 minutes. He moved to another page. 6 weeks ago, driver questioned about vehicle ownership after a minor lane. Violation. No citation. 21 minutes. Whitmore shook his head. Those stops had circumstances. Then the circumstances will be reviewed, Marcus said. That is what an investigation is for. Whitmore looked at him. And you already decided what you think. Marcus held his gaze. If I had already decided, we would not need the footage. That answer seemed to unsettle Whitmore more than accusation would have. Marcus was not offering him an enemy to fight. He was offering a record. Hayes turned another page. The room filled again with the soft scrape of paper and the steady ticking of the clock. Outside the conference room, telephones rang faintly at the main desk. Officers crossed the hallway, unaware that one traffic stop had just become part of something much larger. Marcus looked down at the reports and thought about the people behind the case numbers. People who had gone home after encounters like his and wondered whether they had imagined the tension, whether asking a question had made things worse, whether the outcome would have changed if they had driven a different car or taken another street. He remembered one complaint from a teacher named Calvin Brooks, stopped twice within 4 months on the same stretch of road. Another from a delivery supervisor named Andre Coleman, who wrote that the officer had repeatedly asked who owned his vehicle even after registration was confirmed. The language was restrained, almost apologetic. Marcus had noticed that when the files first arrived, people describing humiliation often worked hard to sound reasonable, as if emotion might weaken the truth. Hayes looked toward Whitmore. "I need you to answer something clearly. Were you aware that these stops were being reviewed?" Whitmore hesitated. "I heard there was an audit." "That is not what I asked." The captain's tone remained controlled. Whitmore stared at the table. "Yes, I knew complaints had been requested." Marcus felt the room shift again. Hayes asked, "Then when you saw Department of Justice material in Mr. Reed's vehicle, why did you continue the detention without calling a supervisor?" Whitmore rubbed his palms together slowly. "I thought he was using it to intimidate me." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I never mentioned my office." Whitmore did not answer. "I never showed credentials connected to my position. I never asked for special treatment. You saw an envelope and decided it was part of a story you had already written about me." Whitmore looked up. "You do not know what I was thinking." Marcus nodded. "You are right. That is why we look at what you did." Hayes closed the folder. "Effective immediately, you are being removed from street duty pending administrative review." Whitmore froze. "Captain, you cannot be serious." "I am very serious." "Because of him?" Whitmore asked, pointing toward Marcus. Marcus did not react. Hayes answered first. "Because of the record." Whitmore stared at the captain, then at the body camera still attached to his uniform. Marcus looked at that small red light too. Earlier, Whitmore had treated it like a silent witness under his control. Now it represented something else entirely. Memory without loyalty. Evidence without ego. Marcus stood. "Captain, I want every related recording preserved before morning." Hayes nodded. "It will be done." Marcus gathered his coat, but left the complaint folder untouched. He looked at Whitmore one last time. "The worst thing that happened tonight was not that you stopped a United States attorney." Whitmore said nothing. Marcus continued. "It was that you behaved exactly the way people had already described when you believed the man in front of you was nobody important." By 8 the next morning, Marcus Reed was back inside the federal building downtown, standing at the end of a conference table while sunlight pushed through the blinds in narrow gold lines. He had slept less than 4 hours, but fatigue was not what occupied his mind. On the screen across the room were timestamps, stop locations, officer identification numbers, and summaries collected over the previous 6 months. Elena Brooks, his senior assistant, sat beside a stack of printed reports. "The precinct preserved everything," she said. "Body camera footage, dash camera footage, dispatch logs, and the overnight administrative report." Marcus nodded. "And the older stops?" Elena turned several pages. "Captain Hayes sent those too. There are more than we expected." Marcus looked toward the screen. Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly, not on every complaint, not even on most of them, but often enough to raise questions that could no longer be treated as coincidence. Marcus had learned long ago that investigations were rarely built around one dramatic moment. They were built around repetition. A 5-minute delay here, an unnecessary question there, a reason for a stop that changed between the radio log and the written report. Individually, each detail could be explained. Together, they formed a shape. "Play last night's footage from the beginning," Marcus said. Elena selected the file. Whitmore's body camera view filled the screen. Marcus watched himself sitting behind the wheel, hands visible, answering questions in the same restrained voice he remembered. He heard Whitmore ask where he was coming from. He heard himself answer. Then came the question about his work. Then the pause. Then the order to step out. Marcus did not look away. It was strange watching an event from the outside, seeing how ordinary everything appeared before it became something else. Elena stopped the video. "For minutes and 12 seconds, she said. That is when dispatch confirms your license and registration. She advanced the timeline. The detention continues for nearly 19 more minutes. Marcus folded his arms. Compare that with the prior complaints. Another analyst pulled up 3 recordings. Different nights. Different drivers. Similar questions. Where are you going? Who owns the vehicle? Why are you in this neighborhood? In one case, a driver explained that he was returning home from a hospital shift. In another, a father was picking up his teenage son from basketball practice. Each stop began with a minor traffic explanation. Each extended after the documents came back clean. Marcus felt something colder than anger settle over him. Anger wanted immediate answers. Evidence demanded patience. Elena looked at him. What do you want to do? Marcus turned toward the window. 20 floors below, traffic moved through downtown as if nothing had happened. We do this correctly, he said. No press leak. No public accusation. No special treatment because I was involved. Elena nodded. Independent review? Yes. And Whitmore's stop data goes to the same team, reviewing everyone else. She hesitated. Even after last night? Marcus turned back. Especially after last night. Across town, Whitmore sat in an administrative office without his patrol assignment, reading the notice Captain Hayes had handed him that morning. He had expected discipline. He had expected embarrassment. What he had not expected was the list attached to the notice. Dates. Case numbers. Archived recordings. Stops he barely remembered. For years, each one had ended when the driver left the roadside. Now they were returning together. Hayes stood in the doorway. You asked me last night if this happened because of Marcus Reed. Whitmore looked up. Hayes placed another folder on the desk. It did not. Whitmore opened it slowly. Hayes continued. His phone call did not create this problem. It only made sure nobody could ignore it anymore. 3 days later, the review team found the detail that changed everything. It was not a dramatic confession, not a hidden message, not a single piece of evidence that suddenly explained months of complaints. It was a pattern buried inside ordinary records. Elena Brooks stood beside Marcus in the federal conference room as a data analyst projected a timeline across the wall. We compared Officer Whitmore's stops by time, location, outcome, and driver information, the analyst said. The numbers are consistent enough to require a deeper review. Marcus studied the screen. On one side were routine stops that ended with warnings or citations. On the other were stops that lasted far longer even after licenses and registrations had been confirmed. The second group contained a striking number of black drivers. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice measured. How many recordings have been reviewed? 38 so far. And how many show the same sequence? The analyst looked down at his notes. 11 clearly. Another 7 need additional context. Elena glanced at Marcus. 11. 11. People who had stood beside cars under flashing lights, answering questions that seemed to multiply after the original reason for the stop had already been resolved. Marcus thought about the night Whitmore stopped him. The questions about his work. The suspicion attached to a government envelope. The refusal to call a supervisor. None of it looked extraordinary when separated into individual moments. Together, it looked different. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. What about other officers in the precinct? The analyst changed the display. There are concerns there too, but Whitmore's numbers stand out. Marcus nodded slowly. Then this does not become a case about one bad officer. Review the supervision, the complaint process, and whether previous reports were properly investigated. Elena understood immediately. The problem was no longer simply what Whitmore had done. It was whether anyone had been paying attention when other people said the same thing first. Across town, Captain Hayes sat with Whitmore in a small administrative office. A representative from Internal Affairs had joined them, carrying a thick file that seemed to grow heavier every time another page turned. You remember Calvin Brooks? The investigator asked. Whitmore frowned. No. High school science teacher. Stopped in March. Whitmore shook his head. I make hundreds of stops. The investigator opened another page. Andre Coleman? No. Another page. Another name. Another night. Whitmore's frustration began to show. What exactly are you trying to prove? Hayes sat quietly beside the window. The investigator answered. We are not trying to prove anything. We are trying to determine whether your decisions followed department policy and constitutional standards. Whitmore looked toward Hayes. You know how street work is. Every situation feels different in the moment. Hayes finally spoke. That is why patterns matter. People rarely notice patterns while they are creating them. The words left Whitmore silent. He looked down at the reports again. For the first time, the names did not look like case numbers. They looked like people. A nurse, a teacher, a warehouse manager, a college student, a father driving home after his son's basketball game. None had Marcus Reed's title. None had a captain racing to the scene. None had a phone call capable of changing the atmosphere in seconds. Back at the federal building, Marcus reached the same conclusion. He turned toward Elena. Last week, if Whitmore had stopped Calvin Brooks instead of me, would Captain Hayes have called? Elena knew the answer before Marcus finished asking. Probably not. Marcus stared at the city beyond the glass. That was the second revelation, and it was more troubling than the first. His position had protected him once people discovered who he was. The others had only their own voices. Marcus turned back toward the evidence. Then we build this around them, he said. Not around me. Elena nodded. And Whitmore. Marcus looked at the frozen image from the body camera, the roadside lights reflected across Whitmore's uniform. He gets the same thing everyone else should have received from the beginning. A fair process, a complete record, and consequences based on what the truth shows. For Marcus, justice was not the moment the cuffs came off. It was the moment the system finally began listening to the people who had never had an important title to make their complaints impossible to ignore. A week later, the first formal findings were delivered in a conference room that felt far quieter than the roadside where everything had begun. Marcus sat near one end of the table with Elena Brooks beside him, while Captain Hayes and members of the independent review team faced them across a row of open folders. Whitmore was not present. His administrative status had been extended while the department completed a broader examination of his conduct and the supervision surrounding it. One reviewer spoke carefully. We found multiple stops where the documented reason for continued detention was not clearly supported by the available record. Marcus listened without interruption. We also found inconsistencies between several written reports and recorded footage. Those matters will be addressed through the appropriate administrative process. Hayes lowered his eyes. For him, the findings carried a different weight. They were not simply about Whitmore. They were about a department that had received complaints and failed to recognize what those complaints were saying together. Captain, Marcus said, what changes are being made? Hayes looked up. Mandatory review of extended traffic stops. Supervisor notification when a detention continues after license and registration are confirmed. Quarterly audits of stop data. And a new process for complaints so they are reviewed collectively instead of one at a time. Marcus nodded. Good. Elena turned toward him. There is also the question of public release. The room became still again. Marcus had known this moment would come. The story could easily become about him. A black United States attorney stopped, questioned, restrained, then recognized. It was dramatic, simple, easy for headlines. But simplicity was exactly what Marcus no longer trusted. If anything is released, he said, the focus should be on the findings and the reforms. One reviewer raised an eyebrow. Your experience is part of the record. Yes, Marcus said, but I am not the reason this matters. He looked around the table. Calvin Brooks matters. Andre Coleman matters. Every person who filed a complaint before anyone important was standing on the roadside matters. He sat back slowly. The words stayed with him. Later that afternoon, Marcus left the federal building and walked 2 blocks to a small coffee shop before heading home. He chose a table by the window and watched traffic move through the intersection outside. Nothing about the street looked different. People changed lanes. Cars stopped at red lights. A patrol cruiser passed without incident. The ordinary rhythm of the city continued. That was what struck him most. Injustice rarely announced itself with dramatic music. Most of the time, it hid inside ordinary moments and ordinary decisions. A question asked differently. A suspicion given more weight than evidence. A person expected to prove they belonged somewhere everyone else was allowed to simply exist. Marcus thought back to Whitmore's phone ringing on the hood of the patrol car and how quickly the atmosphere had changed once his identity became known. That memory no longer felt satisfying. It felt incomplete. The phone call had helped him, but it had also exposed something deeper. Respect had arrived only after status did. That was not justice. That was hierarchy. Real justice had to arrive earlier, before titles, before influence, before anyone asked whether the person being mistreated was important. Several weeks later, The department announced policy changes and confirmed that disciplinary proceedings were underway. No spectacle, no public humiliation, no revenge, just records, findings, consequences, and reforms. Marcus read the statement once, then closed his laptop. Elena, standing in the doorway of his office, asked, "Does it feel finished?" Marcus looked out toward the city. "No," he said, "but it feels honest." He thought again about the roadside, the flashing lights, the body camera, and the silence before Whitmore answered the call. Whitmore had believed the worst moment of that night was discovering who Marcus Reed was. He had been wrong. The real reckoning began when everyone understood that Marcus never needed to be important for what happened to be wrong.